If you're working but struggling because of your disabilities, stop now and ask yourself, is there anything, any equipment, any modification, any change to a work process, any accommodation that could help you stay in your job by making it easier? Your employer may be legally obligated to help you out here. That's what this video is about. Hey, I'm Michael Gilbert. I'm an attorney and a former ALJ with the Social Security Administration. If you have any questions about my qualifications, check out the About page on our channel. Mandatory disclosure. These videos are for educational purposes only. This is not legal advice. Also, while I'm a retired ALJ, SSA does not sponsor or endorse anything I'm about to tell you about the inner workings of the disability bureaucracy. If you're struggling to work because of your disabilities, this video is for you. The series is called 10 Things You Need to Know Now. So as we've discussed in other videos, it's super important to explore your options before filing for SSA disability. In our first video, we covered Thing 1, which may apply to some of you, workers' compensation. Reasonable accommodation is Thing 2. And just a reminder, these are wave tops, not a comprehensive course. The series is designed to help you figure out whether you're on the right road. If you need specific information I don't cover here, please put a question in the comments section where I can either answer it or point you in the right direction to get the information you need. As we've said before, the SSA disability bureaucracy with its zillions of rules and regulations creates a factory-like environment prone to dehumanizing the very real people who come before them. It happens in ways that you can't even find out about until the application is denied 1, 2, 3 different times, and you often never really know the real reason why. The representatives, subject to SSA rules, are part of the system, and as a result, in many cases, you're pretty much on your own. In addition to needing to know the secrets behind that big maze, you'll need to know your options before you file. Otherwise, you're just another passive passenger on the SSA disability ride. We know many truly disabled people who have spent years slogging through the Social Security disability process. It's always best to explore your options before starting the SSA disability process. So stay tuned. If one of these options is better for you and helps you sooner, you should consider it. So let's talk now about the other option for those struggling to work. If work has become just too difficult due to your impairments, you might be thinking you need to quit. However, before you do that, you may want to ask for a reasonable accommodation. Here's the process for getting there. Ask yourself this question: is there a way for my employer to change either my work environment or my work processes so that I could still accomplish the essential functions of my job? Brainstorm a list of those things. Since it's a brainstorm, don't rule anything out yet. Just write it down. Then consider whether anything on the list would allow you to do your job despite your disabilities. Give this some thought. Maybe it's not one thing, but maybe it's a combination of things. Finding creative ways to continue to work and thereby avoid filing for SSA disability may give you the time you need to heal. Also, your employer may be legally required to 1, consider the request, and 2, make a determination as to whether to provide it as a reasonable accommodation. Reasonable accommodation is a legal term, basically 2 parts, right? Reasonable means essentially suitable under the circumstances, and accommodation means an adjustment to work. For our purposes, it means an adjustment to work that is reasonable under the circumstances. There's a body of law attached to its interpretation. So let's go over some wave tops. First thing you need to know is that the reasonable accommodation process is always case by case. It's always fact specific. What does that mean? Well, it means that whether the employer must provide a reasonable accommodation or not depends upon things like the duties of your job, the specific disability at issue, whether the request will be effective, will it actually allow you to do your job, and whether the accommodation requested will work an undue hardship on the employer. So let's apply this. What could your employer provide or allow that would help you continue working? So let's say you did the brainstorming exercise and you came up with X. If only you had X, you say, you could do your job and not have to quit. X stands for the accommodation you need. And then the question is whether that is something reasonable that your employer could provide or allow you to use to do your job. We've seen things like shortened or altered work hours, a fatigue relief mat to stand on, special keyboards, and many others. So let's take a specific example. Let's say you have really bad carpal tunnel syndrome and you're required to work long periods at your computer. You brainstormed some ideas and came up with voice recognition software as a possible accommodation, which would allow you to continue to perform your job despite your carpal tunnel. So you request that your employer allow you to use voice recognition software as a reasonable accommodation. How will your request be evaluated? Remember, what you are asking for must allow you to accomplish the essential functions of your job despite your functional limitations. The analysis goes like this. First, will voice recognition really allow you to perform the essential elements of your job? That is, will it be effective? Often people asking for the accommodation aren't really sure whether the accommodation will be enough for them to keep performing their job. From your standpoint, ask anyway, even if it's unclear. The employer will make their own evaluation as to whether or not it will be effective. Second, will providing you your reasonable accommodation be too burdensome for your employer? If it's too burdensome, would it be reasonable? See how this is all linked together? Third and finally, will it be reasonable under the circumstances for your employer to provide or allow the accommodation? Your employer very well may want to help you. After all, they've trained you in your current job. They probably don't want to lose you. But the request can't be too burdensome on the employer. What are the costs for them? And here, going back to our example of the worker with carpal tunnel requesting voice recognition, it's not just the cost of the software, but the time it will take to get proficient using the software. Are there other options that may be better? All these questions, and perhaps others, factor into the reasonableness part. Some things may, of course, be obviously unreasonable, like an accommodation that is not related to your functional deficits. Say you have carpal tunnel syndrome, but you ask for a stool to sit on while working an assembly line that requires standing to do the job. Not related. Or say you want your boss to hire your friend as a paid assistant to do work for you. That'd be nice if it could happen. Or you don't like your supervisor, so you want to request a new boss as a reasonable accommodation. No, you cannot change your supervisor. That would be unreasonable. Therefore, your employer may legitimately reject the request. Some examples that might be reasonable are things like a temporary or permanent transfer to a job more consistent with your abilities. Whatever the accommodation, whether the employer must provide it or not, will be a fact-specific, case-by-case evaluation. That means things like the size of your employer's business, the cost of the accommodation, and the impact your accommodation might have on the operations of the business are all considered. Most workplaces of any size will generally have internal procedures for dealing with the request. This is because there are legal issues and potential liability at stake if they fail to follow the law. Most employers with 15 or more employees are usually required to engage in the reasonable accommodation process by federal law. But don't forget to check out the law in your state. It may be much more favorable to you. And if it works for you and your employer, the reasonable accommodation can be a very good solution all around. As we'll discuss shortly, it really doesn't matter how big your company is. Ask anyways. Why? They may grant it even though they don't have to under the law. And even if they don't grant it or it's not effective, you have documented why you could not perform this particular job should you need to file for disability. Make it part of your Pounce papers. Now, once again, as we've discussed in previous videos, if you ask your employer for a reasonable accommodation, make sure you put the request in writing. Put your name on it and date it. Keep a copy of your request and any response from your employer with all your other papers related to your struggles to work. Keep them in one place. Where you want to lose them, we'll call them your Pounce papers. This is not hard, but you need to commit to it. Make the commitment to just do it. Now I'm going to tell you why this is important. If in the end you have to leave your job because of your disability, the written request you made at the time proves that your request was made while you were employed and while you were struggling to work. Put it in writing right away. You don't know how long this will go on. and you don't know the end result. For example, perhaps you later leave your job because of your impairments. The reasonable accommodation was never provided, or your employer gave one, but you got worse, or it just wasn't enough help to keep you working there. Now assume you never documented the requests. Then you end up filing for disability. At the hearing a year or two down the road, there is the SSA judge. She has your entire case before her, 1,000 pages of medical records. One of the things she needs to do is not only decide whether you are disabled, but when you became disabled. Was it when you claimed to have left that job? Or was it many months later, more in line with some of the doctor's notes she's considering? How the judge decides just the onset date of your disability may mean you lose many thousands of dollars in past due benefits. She may see that one of your doctor's notes contradicts your testimony about why you left that job. You said at the hearing you could not do the job any longer, but the doctor's notes at the time of the event seems to say, quote, patient leaving job for new opportunity, end quote. In short, there's nothing in the record about you asking for help to do the job or any mention of problems performing the job. Only that you left the job to take a different one. Now, in reality, maybe the other job may have been less taxing, and that's why you switched out. But you ended up leaving that job too. Realize telling the judge at the hearing that you quit work because you could, quote, not do the job anymore just isn't as good by a long shot as giving her a letter you wrote at the time explaining to your employer why you cannot perform that job without some help, i.e., your request for reasonable accommodation. And when the help didn't come or it was not effective, you had to leave the job and try something else. Not having a simple letter documenting why you left your job may even be an unnecessary ding to your credibility. Credibility is a perishable commodity. You lose credibility on little things and suddenly the judge doesn't believe you on the big things. Be careful. Now, what if instead you provided the judge the reasonable accommodation letter you wrote asking your employer for help? It's got a date on it and you can easily fill the judge in on exactly what happened when you had to leave that particular job. After all, the letter has now greatly refreshed your memory. You explain that you were indeed disabled when you left that job and that you were unable to find work that you could do. Your credibility is intact. The judge sees you as someone who was trying to find a way to work but could not. Without that dated letter of request for accommodation, the judge might think your testimony is contradicted by that doctor's note which said you changed jobs for a better opportunity, and thereby infer that the change was not compelled by your disability limitations. In other words, she may think you're just making up a story about why you left your job for the disability hearing, hoping to get more benefits. We'll have a lot more to say on this channel about credibility in the disability process, so stay tuned. Quick secret. If your company has an HR department or someone who handles employee matters and/or a union, be sure to give them a copy of the letter requesting reasonable accommodation. That may prevent your letter from getting lost or landing in the circular file. Most HRO professionals will attempt to get ahead of any reasonable accommodation request or any other request that may implicate litigation. So before we close, let's review reasonable accommodations. Is there another way to do your job that gets around your functional limitations associated with your disability? If so, no matter what size the company you work for, request a reasonable accommodation. From the employer's standpoint, the reasonable accommodation must be effective, e.g., really allows you to do your job. Remember, it's okay to be uncertain whether the accommodation will actually be enough to keep you in your job. If you believe it will improve your ability to do your job, you should request it. It must not be unduly burdensome for your employer. And don't forget to put the request in writing, CC the Human Resources Department and/or the union if applicable, and keep a copy in a safe place where you can find it later in your Pounds papers. Have a question about reasonable accommodation? Put it in the comments section. Think you may be disabled and struggling to work? Subscribe and get on our email list to access free resources and learn things no one else is going to tell you.